education and all that stuff. Good things.
Okay.
So, you want to add anything? Or?
Okay, and I'm gonna try to not go in now too much.
Where and when did you serve in Vietnam?
Well, let me give you some of my background first, and that'll explain to you, I'll help you understand better what I did when I was in Vietnam. I was in Vietnam long before the Tonkin Resolution, so much of what I have to say leads up to that, but I was back in the States in the Pentagon when the Tonkin Resolution was put in effect. But when I graduated from K-State, the Army sent me to an 8-month school to learn how to interpret aerial imagery, pictures taken from an airplane. So I was looking at everything from above. And I expected to go to Vietnam to where that's what I would do, is to look at pictures that had been taken by airplanes. When I got to Vietnam, they said, no, you're not going to do that. You're going to go to a Vietnamese division and be an advisor to the Vietnamese. And so I ended up as an advisor to the Vietnamese Army. So my job there was at the other end of the cycle. In order to get pictures from an airplane, somebody has to tell you what area they want pictures of and what they're looking for. So my job became identifying potential targets, and then we would ask for the planes to go fly those pictures, and they would go to a facility where they were interpreted, and they would write reports and send us the reports of what they saw. So I didn't end up doing what I was trained to do, but in some ways I did. I was in Vietnam from November of '67 to November of '68, so just 50 years ago I was in Vietnam. And we were up in the mountains, what's called the Central Highlands, which is kind of the natives, much like the American Indians in the United States. These were called the Montagnards.
Boneyards? Why were they called the boneyards?
It's kind of like, why were the Cherokee called Cherokee? Why were the Navajo called Navajo? That was their native title that they were given as Montagnards.
How did your experience in Vietnam change you? How do you think Vietnam changed the United States?
That's an interesting question. I would say my experience in Vietnam didn't change me as much as it did a lot of other people. A lot of people came home from Vietnam with a lot of issues that they had a hard time dealing with. Fortunately, I did not have any of those kind of physical or mental issues when I did come home. So I was in that way somewhat saved from that. The second part of that question was?
How do you think the Vietnam War changed the United States?
Well, one of the biggest things that I think it changed was that was the first war that was fought every evening at 6 p.m. on the local news. And so people started witnessing what it was like to be in conflict on a daily basis. And that has changed the way the United States has had to engage in almost all of its conflicts since that time. Because you have to live with the fact that what happens this afternoon will be on the evening news. It wasn't quite that timely in Vietnam. It was a day or two later, but it was still the first time when people were turning on the TV in the evening and seeing what was happening in Vietnam. So in that way, I think it changed the thought process of a lot of people about what we do and how we do it. Some of that's been good, some of that's been bad. It's really, in my opinion, of course my opinion is pretty old by now, it's really put handcuffs on the way that we can fight a battle today. You know, when everything wasn't reported on a daily basis, it was much easier.
Were you growing up during the time where you started seeing the body counts, or had you already been in the military and then back?
Yeah, it was. You know, that kind of became a measure of the conflict, how many people were killed today, how many weren't killed today. And, you know, I think if we would have had the same reporting capability during World War II or World War I, we'd have had the same issues. Probably even greater. I mean, because people, in World War I, people died more horrific deaths than they did at any time in Vietnam, just because of some of the weapons that were used, gases, and things like that, that were not very humane, but were actually very much employed.
What is the most important lesson we should have learned from Vietnam?
Wow, to me, the most important lesson we should have learned from Vietnam is that every nation does not need to be a democracy. There's a lot of the world that has grown up under being ruled by kings and queens, and that's the way those people have learned to live. And so they have the mentality of being told what to do on a daily basis. And so when you put them in a democracy, a lot of them aren't educated well enough to understand what a democracy is. So suddenly to say, you're now a democratic nation, you need to elect a president, you need to elect representatives, you need to elect senators. They don't understand that because they don't have the education to know how to do that, because they've always been ruled by a king or a queen, or in some cases religious sects have been the dominant factor in which causes them to live the way they live. And an example of that I'll share with you is a few years ago we were in Estonia, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And we were talking with this young lady who was our tour guide, and she said that since they've come out from underneath communism, the older generation have gotten very lazy, because under communism they went to work and did whatever it was job they were given, and they were paid at the end of the month whatever the amount of money they had coming. Now under a democracy they have to work for somebody, they have to show up for work every day, they have to produce so much product in order to be paid. And they're not used to doing that. They're just used to showing up from work, putting in their 8 hours and going home. And so in her eyes, and she was a young girl in her 20s and 30s, so she was educated and she understood that, but the people did not understand how to live under a democracy because they'd never been that way. They've always been ruled by a communist regime which told them what time to come to work, when to be home, etc.
One of the things the kids have learned about is the domino theory. Do you think the domino theory was true, and is that what led us to the Vietnam conflict, or how that played into it a bit? Does that make sense?
I think that has something to do with it. You mean the fact that when this nation falls, then another nation's going to fall, and another nation's going to fall. I think at the time frame of in the 50s, when the Vietnam conflict started to build, I think that was probably true. I think we've since learned that it's not true, and that it's not the case. What's next?
What do you think was the goal or purpose of the Vietnam War? Were there compromises that the United States made?
Well, I think we've already talked about the goal was we were there to help the South Vietnamese fight the communist oppression of the North Vietnamese at that time, and so we thought we could come in and we could fight that. One of the things that was difficult for us to understand at that time frame was, in World War II we had the Soviet Union, or excuse me, we had the Germans, and we had the United States, and we lined up and we fought two lines against each other. When we went to Vietnam, we tried to do that by putting up a barrier along the border called the DMZ, the militarized zone, where the North Vietnamese would come south. We thought we could stop them at that point. What we didn't take into effect is that they would go around that, and we would set up pockets throughout South Vietnam. And so we started fighting what's called a non-linear war. And that was difficult for us to understand because we hadn't encountered that before, fighting what's called a non-linear warfare where you're not lined up facing each other. So that was a new factor for us. I forgot part of what you wanted to ask there.
Were there compromises that the United States made?
Well, I think there were at the very end. I mean, we obviously had to compromise to get out. Specifically what they were, I can't tell you, because I don't know. I wasn't involved in that.
How were you received when you returned to the United States?
That's very interesting. That was When we returned from Vietnam, we flew on a military airplane in uniform to an air base in California, about 50 miles from San Francisco. Before we could leave the air base, we had to take our uniforms off and put on civilian clothes because of the way we were going to be greeted when we got off the base and we got to the airport. And so we had to travel in civilian clothes. That's when I got on the plane. When we landed in Kansas City, when I came home, it was very much different. The people in Kansas City were very receptive, and they recognized the fact that we were returning from Vietnam. And so the reception in Kansas City was quite nice. The reception in California was not so nice.
What lessons do you think the U.S. learned on its treatment of veterans?
Wow, that's probably more current than it is from Vietnam, because in Vietnam, coming home from Vietnam, I don't think there was a great deal of attention put to how to treat the returning veterans. And so that has changed over the years. It has become more positive in the way they're treated today. Unfortunately, there's too many of the Vietnam veterans who don't recognize that, in my opinion, do not recognize that and don't seek the help that is available to them.
His wife is one of the veteran chairmen for our DAR chapter, so they have a veterans program at Via Christi once a month, and she takes all kinds of treats and games and things to the veterans, and so, did you see any of that difference when you came back with how the soldiers were received then versus how they
Well,
were
we
now?
just talked about that. So when we landed at Travis Air Force Base in California, before we could leave the base, we had to take our uniforms off and put on civilian clothes because of the people who were outside the gate and the people who were at the San Francisco International when we got there to fly home. So it was, there were protesters and demonstrators that were out there. It's kind of a joke that we put on your civilian clothes because you're all coming back with duffel bags and short haircuts and everything else, and so the fact that you're in civilian clothes doesn't change a whole lot. But as I told them, when we landed in Kansas City, it was a totally different reception. It was a very good reception getting off an airplane in Kansas City. So that was different.
Were there positive outcomes to the Vietnam conflict?
Good question. Probably the one positive output is we learned that we could not continue to fight and engage like we've been doing in the past. That we had to take into consideration what is it actually the people want us to do for them.
What do the history books and popular media have wrong about Vietnam?
Not being a history guy, not being one who's read a lot of history books since Vietnam, I have a hard time answering that question. I really don't have a comment.
Is there anything that's commonly misunderstood about Vietnam? Because it's still kind of controversial.
Very much so, very controversial, but I don't know. I don't have an answer for that.
What do history books and popular media have correct about Vietnam?
Probably that we were trying to impose something upon on the people that they didn't want. They weren't really ready to accept it.
Were you there during the era of the Vietnamization where they were taking the South Vietnamese troops, trying to get them prepared to fight on their own, and we would ride off with this?
That was my job.
Was that successful?
I was part of the Military Assistance Advisory Committee, and And we were a team that was assigned to the 23rd Airborne Division, and we were there to help them train and do the things we did.